Hi, this is Mr. Manley, and I'm going to talk about domain restrictions for an inverse function, or domain restrictions to get an inverse function. For instance, if I have this function, f of x equals x plus 6 squared, it is not going to have an inverse function because what would be the inverse, if we look at it graphically, is going to have not pass the vertical line test. So here's the graph of x plus 6 squared. And then if I look at the inverse, let's think about it as the reflection through the line y equals x. So there's a line y equals x. And then if I reflect this graph here, if I reflect that through the line y equals x, I get something that looks like this. And that graph does not pass the vertical line test. So I can draw a vertical line, I can hit the graph in more than one point, therefore it does not pass the vertical line test. So in trying to find the inverse of f, there's f, and then in saying that this is the inverse of f, it's not a function. So what we need to do here is put a domain restriction on this function f. So I'm going to restrict and eliminate the left part of the graph. It doesn't matter if you choose the left part or the right part. All we're trying to do is trying to set ourselves up so that when we do the inverse, it will be a function. So I'm going to go x plus 6 squared and say that x is greater than or equal to negative 6. There is the domain restriction that produces this graph, and this graph now has an inverse. If I look at that graph, its inverse, if you look down to the right here, this would be the inverse of that graph, and that is a function. So we found a domain restriction, we'll produce it. Now let's find the inverse. So when I take f of x equals x plus 6 squared, I'm going to go y equals x plus 6 squared. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. I want to switch the x's and y's first since I'm doing inverse. So I'm going to go x is equal to y plus 6 squared. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I do that, that's going to give me a plus or minus equal to y plus 6. So y is equal to negative 6 plus or minus rad x. And now, if I look at this graph in the bottom right, which is the inverse of this, I can say that that is going to use this part of the equation. So you see the plus minus here. I just realized that, okay, the plus part is what I want. So the inverse function is f negative 1 of x is equal to negative 6 plus rad x. And I don't need to say anything about the domain. This equation is this graph. That is what it is. There are other questions that you're asked about in your textbook in regards to this. For instance, the domain and the range, and those are questions that you can answer based upon understandings from previous sections. So the thing that I wanted to look at here was the domain restriction.